Welcome to High Strangeness, where we ask questions and explore all that is strange and unexpected in our reality.
Welcome to High Strangeness. I'm Tony, and this is the place where we talk all things strange and unexpected in our reality. We are in October, where spooky and eerie are in the air. There are some topics that are just made for this time of the year, and behind those topics, there are always a mystery and there are truths and facts as well. Today, we're going to see where this topic takes us. Now, I'll start off by saying, in the shadowy depths of New Jersey's Pine Barrens, a creature of legend and lurks, a twisted offspring of a cursed origin. Locals whisper at its piercing cries, leathery wings, and hoofed feet that echo through the darkened woods. There's a haunting enigma that has terrified generations. But what are we talking about? It's the Jersey Devil. Now, on our show today, we are lucky to have Dr. Brian Riegel with us. He's a professor for the history of science, technology, and medicine at Kean University in Union City, New Jersey. Some of his research interests are the historic aspects of human evolution, racial anthropology, creationism, pseudoscience, the occult, monster studies, and who really discovered America. Also, he's been on air too through Hulu's original documentary Sasquatch, Episode 3, as well as the Science Channel's documentary Mythical Beasts, PBS's series Drive-By History, and the History Channel's series True Monsters. He's also the author of a number of books related to the things we just mentioned and many other subjects. And of course, my favorite subject today, the Jersey Devil. The book's called The Secret History of the Jersey Devil, How Quakers, Hucksters, and Benjamin Franklin Created a Monster. So with that, I want to welcome Brian on to the show today. Brian, how are you doing?
Good. How are you? Thanks for having me on.
Very good. I'm very excited about this topic today, and I want to ask you a question. How did I do in my spooky entry of the Jersey Devil? Good?
Very spooky.
All right. Very good. I feel better about that.
I tingle.
So, Brian, have you always been a Jersey guy, or have you been from somewhere else and you found yourself in the East Coast there? What's your history there?
I was born and raised in the Ironbound section of Newark.
Nice.
And then moved to Kearny, across the river when Newark went through the riots in the late 60s. My family moved across the river to Kearny and went to Kearny High School and couldn't wait to get out.
You had enough?
I joined the U.S. Army when I was 17 and went into the Armored Cavalry. I wanted to go to college. I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to be a historian. But my high school counselor told me that people like me didn't go to college.
Oh, brother.
Yeah, that's something a kid always wants to hear.
Right.
But I went overseas. I traveled the world for several years. Served on the Iron Curtain Border Patrol. Got to go to, I'm trying to think of the places I can tell you I went to, and the places I'm not allowed to tell you.
Right, if not, you'll have to kill me.
I had it. I searched the world over, found artifacts, stole documents,
wow,
romanced femme fatales, but the problem is, despite what some people think, the Earth is spherical.
Right.
It's not flat. And if you run in any one direction long enough, you wind up back where you started.
True that.
And so, I went through all that to get out of New Jersey, and in the end, wound up right back in,
Yes.
where I started.
Well, look, I'm from there too, as well. Not as exciting a past, but I do go back every now and then. In fact, I was there for a few weeks this summer, where I always seem to gain about 10 to 12 pounds. I can't keep away from bakeries and pizza shops and all that stuff. It's a difficult thing. Have you ever had Panzerottis?
Yeah, they've got good pizza here.
They do. They've got great pizza. My favorite.
Sorry?
I was going to say, have you ever had a Panzerotti?
I don't think so.
Okay. It's something more in South Jersey, but it's like...
That sounds like something you'd pay a hooker to do.
You probably could bring one of those with...
Want a Panzerotti? $50.
Yeah, it's a deep fried inside out pizza, but you could probably do some interesting things with that. Yeah. Awesome. Is it still hot and humid out there right now?
Oh yeah, it was 91 a little bit ago.
Wow. For those listening and watching,
several...
I was just going to say we're interviewing at the very end of August. So anyway, go ahead, sir.
Which is not that unusual for here.
Yeah, well, I was going to say I was out there in July, and every time I walked outside, my glasses got fogged up, and I felt like I was just wet the whole time. I forget that every time I leave and come back, and I come back every couple of years, but it was miserable. I was thinking, why am I doing this? Awesome. Well, look, Brian, I'm excited you're with us today, and I'm really excited for this topic. So let's talk about the Jersey Devil. I learned and heard a lot about this as a young person growing up, and I think it's an interesting and fun story. But, you know, there's facts and then there's what you hear, right? What you grew up hearing about. So I'd like to get into some of that, but before we actually dive into that, I'd always like to learn a little bit about the person who wrote the book. Would you be able to tell us a little more? You did already, but just kind of what got you to the point in life where you are? What got you interested in this topic enough to write a book? Could you share some of that with the audience?
Yeah, sure. I was always interested in, I grew up on In Search Of with Leonard Nimoy and Johnny Quest and the Thunderbirds and the Adventures of Tintin. And, as a little kid sitting in front of the TV, all I could think was, that's what I want to do. I don't know how I can get to do it, but that's what I want to do. And so, I worked very hard, despite, I was one of those kids in high school that was not on track to be a scholar. Or a writer, or with my family history, I should have on my resume having done a double nickel at Rawway, for those non-New Jerseyans out there, Rawway is the state prison,
right? And
but I managed to avoid that somehow. To this day, I'm not even sure how I managed to do it, but I managed to avoid it. And I didn't care what anybody said about whether I could or couldn't do this sort of work. And I was extremely lucky to encounter a number of people who encouraged my work and pointed me in the right direction. And was lucky enough to have met someone to spend my life with, Dr. Lisa Knox, who was also a historian. Unfortunately, she passed away 3 years ago from cancer.
Sorry.
But if it wasn't for her, I wouldn't be here. So we have her to thank for that, because she was like one of the very first people who really believed in what I was trying to do, and didn't make fun of me for being a nerd who wrote or a nerd who read lots of books. The first time when we first started dating, which was like 1985, we were together 35 years.
Wow.
And I was living in this crappy little apartment above a one-family home with this pair of sort of dotty old Polish couple who owned the building. And the first time we actually was a office romance, because while I wanted to be a writer, I had no idea how to make that happen. You know, writers were these sort of godlike celestial figures that you'd see on, you know, being interviewed on the Merv Griffin show, and it would have been less unusual for me growing up in the Ironbound to meet a writer, or it would have been less unusual for me to meet Bigfoot in the Ironbound rather than a writer. And so I just, you know, I had this. To be a historian, you have to have a kind of crazy, stupid motivation, because everyone's going to tell you you're wrong. Everyone's going to tell you you can't do this. And you have to really be willing to say, you know, I don't care about that. I want to do this, and that's what I'm going to do. I wanted to study monsters. And I have friends who went to some of the best universities in the world. I have friends who went to Oxford, Cambridge, Princeton. And talking with them, they were like, you know, if I had gone to Princeton, I wouldn't have been able to write the doctoral dissertation I did, because when I said I want to write about monsters, they would have said, no, you can't do that. That's not scholarly.
Right.
But I was lucky enough to find a few people eventually at the school I went to who you know, sort of encouraged me. And my first book was about this guy named Henry Fairfield Osborne, who was the longtime president of the American Museum of Natural History. He's the guy who started or organized the Central Asiatic Expedition in the 1920s, led by Roy Chapman Andrews, who's the guy that Spielberg based Indiana Jones on.
Nice.
He was a real guy.
Yeah.
And if you've ever gone to the Museum of Natural History in New York, go up to the 4th floor where all the dinosaurs are. Virtually every single one of them was collected by Henry Fairfield Osborne and Roy Chapman Andrews in Mongolia in the 1920s.
Wow.
And so I wound up writing my dissertation about him. And in my work, in that book, which turned out to be my first book, I came across a lot of stuff about monsters, which seemed odd to me because for years I was being told monsters are not something you write about, they're not important, you know, they don't exist. And so when I finished the doctoral dissertation, I said, you know, I'm just going to go for it. The way I did everything I want to do this. Everyone says I can't do it or shouldn't do it. I'm going for it. And I started writing books about monsters. And I wrote the book about the history of cryptozoology, and did huge amounts of work in primary documents. It's basically a biography of Grover Krantz, who I'm sure you and your audience know who Grover Krantz was. And I decided, okay, I want to write a book about this guy. The problem with historians is, real historians, not the fake historians you see on you know, Ancient Aliens.
Right.
Our primary motivation is primary documents. You can't say anything in a book. A real historian will never say anything in a book unless they can cite, this is where this came from. If you're going to say that, like when I said that Grover Krantz hated Rennie DeHinden, one of the great amateur monster hunters, I can't just say that, or I couldn't just say that. I had to be able to say, I can say this because I have these dozens of letters in which these two wacky guys, both of whom think the other one's crazy, writing about Bigfoot. And so I can say that because here are the documents that show this is what they said about each other. And so, you know, when Hurricane Sandy came through and, you know, basically laid waste to most of New Jersey back in, when was that, 2016?
Sounds about right.
17?
Yeah.
Whatever that was.
Yeah.
I had since acquired the job at Kean University, and one of our senior most historian, Frank Esposito, who was a historian. He just recently retired. So if you're watching this, Frank, hello. He is an incredible historian of New Jersey and a historian of Native Americans. And we ran into each other in the university cafeteria right after the school reopened after Sandy, and we're sitting there talking. And I think it was Monster Quest had just run an episode on the Jersey Devil. And we were discussing it, and all of a sudden it hit both of us. We should write a book about this. A proper historical study of this thing. And so that's what we did. We sat down, we started tracking down all the primary sources. We ransacked libraries from Boston to Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, and found all this important paperwork, because that's what we do. That's what historians do. Yeah. That's why we know what's going on. We've read I always like to make the analogy that historians are the people who read the inside of the game box. Back when they still made boxed games, like Life and all that.
Right.
They always would print the directions, the rules, on the inside of the cover of the box. And nobody ever read that. You just started playing. Mm-hmm. But historians are the ones who read the inside of the box. We know what's going on. To use an expression that's become popular lately, we bring the receipt. We dig through the primary documents. We dig through the letters. We dig through the notebooks. We dig through the stuff that nobody else has looked at. Like when I did the Bigfoot book, the Grover Krantz book, I was really astonished that there was so much of this material out there in various libraries and museums, and no one had ever looked at it. I mean, literally, I still think I'm the only person, when Grover Krantz died in 2002, I think, his family, his estate, donated all his rooms and boxes full of letters and all this stuff. They donated it to the Smithsonian. And so the Smithsonian put it into there's a offshoot of the Smithsonian called the National Anthropological Archive. And all of his material, a huge amount of stuff, went into the National Anthropological Archive. And so when I found that out, I was on the next Amtrak down south to Washington to go through this stuff. And I very quickly realized I was the first person to look at this material. And I got to tell you, I think I'm still the only one who's ever looked at this stuff. That's one of the big problems I have with cryptozoologists. They want to find monsters. Okay, you want to find a monster. But their approach is to go out into the woods. With the night vision goggles and all that. And
yeah. You're
never going to find one of these things that way because they don't exist in the wild.
Right.
They're not alive. Now, I need to break here to say I'm going to have to upset some of your listeners. There's no Jersey Devil. There's no Bigfoot. There's no Yeti. There's no Mothman. There's no Loch Ness Monster. None of that stuff is real. You're not going to find it by tramping around the woods with night vision goggles on. You will find them, however, in libraries and archives, because that's where all the really important evidence is. And so I spent the better part of 5 years going through all that material, and that's when I came up with the Searching for Sasquatch book. And when Frank Esposito and I decided to work on the Jersey Devil, it wasn't even a question. This is how we work. This is how historians behave. We just went out and started looking. Where's the primary sources? Where are the letters? Where's the material that is directly associated with this? If you, for example, go on the internet and you look up, you type in, to Google Jersey Devil. you'll get hundreds and hundreds of pages of stuff. With very few exceptions, it's all garbage. It's all the same stories told again and again and again. And Frank and I didn't want to do that. We said, we're historians, we're professional scholars. We're not going to do that crap. We're going to avoid all of that. We didn't look at any of it. We didn't look at any of the popular books. We started to track down the primary sources, and there was enough, we felt, that we could put this story together, and the next thing you know, bada boom, bada bing, bada bam.
Yeah.
We got a book on the Jersey Devil.
That's awesome. Well, that's why I was so excited about this, is because sometimes the facts and the details are just as interesting as the things people make up. Why did we go here to create this, or to make people believe this or that exists? Sometimes those details are fun to understand. So I'm glad that we're going to talk about some of that today, because I think that's important. You're right. Anybody can say anything, right? And it happens all the time. But what backs up to prove the story is true or not true? Like what's there? So I love that.
Well, this is going to sound a little odd, but I'm not interested in truth.
Facts?
Truth is an objective or subjective idea.
Good point.
History is about facts, not truth.
Yeah.
To quote one of my favorite fictional characters, archaeology is not about truth. It's about facts. If you want truth, the philosophy class is right down the hallway.
Right.
So that's what we want. We want facts. We want evidence of these things happening.
Yeah.
Now the basic story of the Jersey Devil, the popular story of the Jersey Devil, is that 1735. This character called Mother Leeds. She's living in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey. She's already had 12 kids. She's giving birth to her 13. It's always 13.
Right.
It's always got to be 13. She gives birth to her 13th child, but instead of a child coming out, it's this horribly deformed thing with wings, which yelps at the assembled family and at the midwife. And that's one of the interesting things about the Jersey Devil. It never speaks. There's only one bit of the story where it's said that the thing comes anywhere close to speaking, and that's when it just sort of yelps at the family, climbs into the fireplace, up the chimney. Why it didn't just go out the door,
Right.
And then flies off into the woods and spends the next 300 years accosting innocent passersby, and then and again, doesn't really do anything.
Yeah.
That's one of the funny things about the Jersey Devil. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't give premonitions. It doesn't steal, children and eat them. Nothing. It just sort of is there.
Yeah.
The image I always get is a couple of people are walking through the Pine Barrens, and they hear a noise, and they look up in the tree, and there's the Jersey Devil. And the Jersey Devil, and the people seeing it don't react. They just stare at it. They don't run away.
Right.
They don't. And then another Jersey Devil comes along on the same branch as the first one.
Okay, so
And
two
sees
Jersey
these
Devils.
people standing there. Yeah,
Okay.
now there's two of them.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And the second Jersey Devil says to the first Jersey Devil, "Why aren't they running away? They always run away." And the first one says, "I don't know." And the second one says, "Did you do the thing?" He says, "Yeah, I did the thing." And the people they're just like staring at this thing up in the tree, and the two poor Jersey Devils get so discouraged, they just sort of shrug their shoulders and turn around and walk away and disappear into the woods, brokenhearted because they couldn't scare anybody.
Yeah.
Excuse me. But there's a lot of interesting things, but this whole Mother Leeds story is just that. It's just a story. It never happened.
Yeah.
What Frank Esposito and I found out was that there's the other story, the reality story, which is, we think, much more interesting This isn't a story. The story of the Jersey Devil isn't the story of some half-assed, half-pony bird with wings.
Right.
This is a story of the foundations of the United States. It's about the founding of the country. It includes some of the most important early people in American history, including Ben Franklin. And it's a story about oppression of the native people, oppression of Quakers, stealing of land, shady land deals, and sort of political, sort of bare-knuckle political maneuverings that make stuff going on today seem like nothing.
Mm-hmm.
We think here in the 21st century, we invented crazy politics. But the 17th century, they basically invented this. Crazy, fake news, political rivalries is in part invented by Ben Franklin. We think of Ben Franklin as the guy on the $100 bill with the glasses and the long hair. Always be careful of guys who wear glasses and long hair. That's just going to float right over on top of everybody's head. We think of him, as the founding father, but he could be a real dick. And he basically starts telling these stories, which help ruin the family that is most closely associated with the Jersey Devil story, the Leeds family.
So there is a Leeds family?
He basically just makes stuff up.
There is a Leeds family? There was a Leeds family?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
They've been around forever. You can't go to South Jersey to this day and chuck a rock without hitting something with the Leeds name on it. There's a Leeds Avenue. There's Leeds Street. The Leeds family basically helped found Atlantic City. So they were major players. If the main Leeds guy I'm talking about, Daniel Leeds, he's sort of the center of the story. He's the person the whole story sort of revolves around. Had he been born half a generation later, we'd be talking about him as a founding father.
Interesting.
Politically well connected.
Yeah.
A number of his sons fought with great distinction in the Revolution. I mean, the Cumberland Infantry was basically the whole Leeds family. So they were important players in not just New Jersey history, but American history, because they're there where it's all going on. But what happens is that very interesting and very important story gets bastardized down into the search for a monster.
Interesting. Okay. You just rattled off a number of things that I hope we can spend some time diving into, because several things you said, I was like, really? I like that. Let's learn about that. Okay. Before we go into some of that, though, the Pine Barrens, it's just, why? Because it's a eerie place. Do you think it just was the right place to say these things happened, or any feelings about the Pine Barrens?
Yeah, well, the Pine Barrens is, when people think of New Jersey, they tend to think of sort of northeast New Jersey, where the oil refineries are, and the big cities. It's Newark, Elizabeth, they're all there. Plainfield are all there. And people tend to think of the Sopranos. They think of Bruce Springsteen. Mm-hmm. But the whole lower half of the state is basically this enormous pine forest. Thick, heavy pine forest. If we dropped you into there and we didn't tell you where you were, we said, okay, where do you think you are? You probably would not say New Jersey.
Exactly.
You'd think Oregon, Washington State, and so there was, in the 17th, when Europeans are first coming to America, they're going into, Boston is established, New York is established, Washington, D.C. doesn't, nobody's even thinking about that yet. Baltimore isn't there yet. Newark only gets founded in 1600. It's mostly just wilderness. And there are Quakers. Quakers is this religious denomination, which still exists. There's still lots of Quakers around. And they are fleeing persecution in England. They wind up in Boston, and the Protestant hierarchy of Boston hates them because the Quakers were all about personal responsibility. They said, you don't need a priest, you don't need a preacher, you have you and your relationship with God, and you don't need a middleman. You don't need any middle management. and these Protestants that start coming to will eventually be the northern part of the United States. They have a powerful clergy who wants to control everything, and so they hate the Quakers. And so the Quakers wind up in Boston, where they're in charge. They get chased out of there, and they wind up going south, and they wind up in what is now South Jersey, from sort of Philadelphia to the Atlantic Ocean. And they start creating towns and settlements. Before Philadelphia even exists, they found the city of Burlington, which is still there. In fact, the Quakers, they didn't call them churches; they called them meetings. A building where followers go and you have your various rituals, which did not have a leader. The way the Quakers worked is Sunday at the appointed time, you went to the meeting, and everybody just sort of sat there, staring at each other. Until somebody sort of was inspired to talk, and they would stand up and they would speak, and then they'd sit down, and then maybe somebody else would. And if nobody wanted to speak that day, everybody just sat there in silence, staring at one another. And so they built a meeting out of the ship that they sailed to America in, and the meeting they built is still there. To this day, you can go in, and it's been sort of upgraded and bits added onto it, but that original core meeting, core Quaker church, is still there. And the wood that they built the pews and the walls was scavenged from the ship that they came over on. They came over on a boat called the Shield, and they come over and they head up to what will be Delaware River, and they have no idea where they're going. And they decide, we're going to follow up this river, go north on the Delaware River, until the ship can't go any further. And so they're sailing up the Delaware River, and they start to feel the bottom of the boat scraping the bottom of the river. So they just cut the wheel to the right, ran it up on the ground, and said, all right, here we are.
Here, yeah.
This is where we're starting. And that's Burlington. And I always thought it would be a fun idea. There is because this became a very popular thing in the early 2000s for towns and cities that are by rivers to make a river walk. You build a boardwalk or concrete, so people can stroll, and it's very nice. And they have one of these in Burlington, and it's right over the spot where the Shield would have been run aground. And I always thought it would be interesting to start, like an archaeological expedition to see, because they stripped the thing down. Any bits of it that they could use, they tore off.
Yeah.
But the keel, the main spine of the ship, which the whole thing is attached to, they didn't. That was left behind in the mud of the river, mud of the Delaware River. And over years, because it's heavy, it just sort of slowly sank into the mud until it disappeared. So cold water tends to preserve wood. And so there's a good chance that what's left of the Shield, this boat which, should be as popular as the Mayflower, is in the muck of the Delaware River.
Wow.
Right, at the edge of Burlington.
That's amazing.
And so this guy, Daniel Leeds, he wants to be a philosopher. He's a Quaker. He's born and raised in England. When he's 25, his family his mother dies of smallpox. I actually found her grave in London.
Wow.
Or at least a spot where the grave was supposed to be.
Yeah.
The problem with the Quakers in graves is they didn't believe in putting up headstones, so you just have ground. But anyway, so Daniel Leeds, his brother, and his dad come over. The dad winds up going to Shrewsbury, and the brother and he wind up in Burlington, which has only just been founded. And Daniel Leeds wants to be a philosopher. He wants to bring the ideas of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment to North America. Because remember, there's no United States yet. It's just North America. In fact, because the British government has such control of it, they call it British North America. And so he wants to bring enlightenment, he wants to bring education, he wants to bring mathematics and astronomy. And the Quakers don't really care for this. They think he's getting a little too occulty. And he decides, I'm going to write the word just flew out of my head. Almanac. He does a one-page almanac, the broadsheet, because they only had one printer in the area. Printing comes to America relatively slowly, but he manages. There's a printer who's a Quaker, comes to Burlington, will eventually move to Philadelphia, and so printing presses are expensive. They have a lot of moving parts that are hard to find, hard to make. And so when you printed things, you kept it simple. And so Daniel Leeds decides to do a broadsheet almanac, which means it's just one page, only printed on one side. And he puts a lot of his ideas about science and religion and all of this, and the Quaker fathers hate it. And they go around and they buy up every copy of this thing that they can get their hands on and burn them. Daniel Leeds is not just the first author south of New York, he's the first censored author south of New York. Because there were a couple of almanacs done in Boston and New York prior to this. And so he gets upset. He says, well, maybe I just didn't do this the right way. So he decides to do a book called The Temple of Wisdom, where he brings together all of his ideas about science and religion and art and astronomy and astrology and puts it together into this thing, and he thinks, okay, great, they're going to love this. And they hate the book even more than they hated the almanac. And so they burn all those.
Oh,
in fact, to this day, we only know of one surviving copy of the Temple of Wisdom, and it's in the Pennsylvania Historical Society in Philadelphia. And his almanacs are also extremely hard to find. I had to go all the way to London, to the British Library. They had a copy because a lot of Quakers start off in London.
Yeah.
And so I had to travel all the way there to see one of the few remaining copies of the first Leeds Almanac. And it was really quite moving because, excuse me, books, publishing, these are visceral objects. And I go through the catalog there at the British Library, and I said, okay, look at here it is. And can I see this? And I'm sitting in the big reading room, and they wheel out this cart, with the squeaky wheels, and they drop this giant notebook, huge, thick notebook. And there's something different on every page. It's a collection of what they call ephemera. Ephemera is bits of paper, cards and letters and newspapers and things. And I'm turning the pages to where it's supposed to be, and I turn the page, and here it is. One of the few remaining copies of Daniel Leeds' first almanac. And it's really quite emotional, because he held this in his hand.
Wow.
This guy, not just Daniel Leeds, but the printer, and, this is what I tell my students. This is as close to time travel as you can get.
Yeah.
Is to hold an ancient book or an ancient document or a letter or whatever in your hands, and smell it. It has a smell to it, and you can't get closer to history than that. And that's why here at Kean, we basically force the students to go looking for primary sources and to go into the archives and to look at this stuff. On a completely unrelated project recently, I was in London to do research, and at the College of Physicians in London, ancient venerable social club for doctors, and they have a huge library of important medical documents. And the very first discussion of primates, prior to this, I mean, obviously the people in Africa, they knew all about them. It was nothing new to them. But to Europeans, these creatures were monsters. They were mythical. And a British cargo ship is coming back from Africa, and some of the sailors, before they left, bought a little tiny bonobo monkey that they bring with them on the ship and bring it back to England. And unfortunately, the poor little thing dies as soon as it gets to England. And an important scientist finds out about this, and he decides he wants to get it, dissect it, and do a proper scientific monograph to show that these primates are not mythical creatures, they're not monsters, they're living things. And so the reason why I tell the story is that in the College of Physicians, they have this guy's original notes. The notes he was taking, he's sitting there at a dissecting table, dissecting this poor little dead chimp, and he's writing notes about what he's finding. And they're there, so I'm holding these things in my hands, and it smelled like blood to me, because the pages were all stained.
Yeah.
And I mean, you're practically sitting with this guy as he's dissecting this poor little, chimp who's been torn away from his home, torn from his family, dragged all the way, halfway around the world, only to die in this strange place. And now this guy is dissecting him. And that is, it gives you a view of the past that you can't get from a Wikipedia page.
Right.
I won't even let my students use Wikipedia for research. I said, no, you're an adult now. You're at a university. You're not in the 7th grade.
Right.
You go and you look for the primary documents. And they get really upset at me. But then when it's all over with, they're like, oh man, I'm so glad you had us do that. So that was what it was like holding this lone copy of Leeds' Almanac.
Wow.
And so time goes by. He wants to be like a wise old owl, Daniel Leeds. He wants to be the guy who's bringing philosophy and enlightenment and science to the New World. And keep in mind, this is at a time when, here on the East Coast, New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, this was the edge of the empire.
Yeah.
Anything west of the Watchung Mountains, that was like the moon. People still thought there were monsters. Thomas Jefferson, in part, sent the Lewis and Clark expedition west because he thought, well, if you find any monsters, see if you can catch one. So this is the way they see this. And so that what happens is Daniel Leeds, his almanac is burned, his book is burned. Now he gets upset, as you can well imagine.
Right.
And he decides to change. He's not going to be a wise old owl. He's going to turn himself into an attack dog. And he starts attacking the Quaker religion by publishing books and pamphlets. The Quakers are horrible. The Quakers are this. The Quakers are that. Excuse me. And he starts to get this reputation in the Quaker world of being evil. One of the major Quaker apologists writes a book in which he calls Daniel Leeds Satan's harbinger. Now, that doesn't seem like a bad thing today. It's almost adorable,
Yeah.
you know. But in the 1770s, 1780s, that was like, you know, today imagine politicians, they, oh, you're a socialist, you're a globalist, all of which is nonsense. But calling someone Satan's harbinger in the 1670s was like calling them a globalist today.
Yeah.
And so his reputation starts getting associated with the occult. And as time goes by, the Leeds family starts to get referred to as these sort of shady, occult-like characters.
Wow.
The Leeds family was well educated. They even had a royal unit crest, like a family crest,
Wow.
for the Leeds family. You don't get that if you're a bum, you know. And so they go from being these very sort of progressive, liberal bringers of the Enlightenment to being basically monsters hiding in the woods of Pine Barrens. And the story sort of goes dormant for decades until the early 1900s. In Philadelphia, there is I don't even know what to call it. It was called a dime museum. But a dime museum is basically a circus sideshow that doesn't move around. It's in a building. It stays in the building. And so in Philadelphia, there's the 9th and Arch Street Dime Museum. Unfortunately, it's gone. It's in this magnificent building, you know, with the glass. And if you go to 9th and Arch Street today, it's a parking lot.
Right.
It's like one of those parking lots in the business section of town where, you know, all the office workers park their cars. There's a great picture of it that you can find online very easily. But they're starting to lose customers. Because even back then, people needed to be constantly stimulated. You know, so what was unusual and fantastic and rare today, tomorrow, so what?
Right.
And so the attendance starts dropping off, and they're frantic. We got to do something to get the rubes back in. And they hear about this legend of the Leeds Devil, because it had gone from sort of a political thing to a more occult thing. So there's this idea of the Leeds Devil, and the guys at the 9th and Arch Street Dime Museum is, how can we use this? And they say, okay, we have to have a better name. Leeds Devil doesn't quite sing.
Yeah.
And so they sit down, you know, discuss, and suddenly, you know, the light bulb goes off. I've got it. Jersey Devil. And so now they're advertising. Come see the Jersey Devil. But they don't have a Jersey Devil because there is no Jersey Devil. And so they find a guy in Albany, New York, who is a dealer in rare animals. He's got a kangaroo. Now, God knows where this guy in Albany, New York, got a hold of a kangaroo, but he's got a kangaroo. So the guys at the 9th and Arch Street Museum, they rent the kangaroo. They bring it down to Philadelphia. They make some cardboard wings, which they attach to the back of the kangaroo. They paint the kangaroo green, and they put it up on stage.
Amazing.
And so people can come through. And they had a little kid in the curtains, you know, the side of the stage, with a long stick with a nail in the end of it. And so whenever a new group of people came in, the little kid would poke the kangaroo. And of course, the kangaroo would start jumping around and squealing. You know, if somebody poked me with a nail in the end of a stick, I'd do the same.
Right.
And so the crowd starts showing up, and they start making money again. But eventually, even that wears off. And people started saying, you know, I don't think that's a monster. That looks like a kangaroo that somebody glued wings onto. And so after a while, the whole thing sort of, you know, peters out, and they send the kangaroo back to Albany. And one of my favorite parts of this aspect of the story is a reporter comes to talk to the guys at the museum. And these things they call them museums, but they weren't really museums like we think of museums today.
Yeah.
They weren't like these, shrines to learning and science. They're sideshows. And the reporter goes up to the guy and says, so this was all fake, right? And I was like, yeah. And the reporter's like, well, why did you do that? And the guy's like, duh. This is a dime museum. This is what we do. We fake stuff. We lie to people. That's what the whole dime museum is about. It's making up wacky stuff to get people to want to come and see it and pay their 10 cents to get it.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of that's the end of the story.
It's hilarious.
People realize, people with a brain in their head realize, this is all just a fake, thing. But the genie was out of the bottle, and now you start getting people saying, I saw that thing in my yard, and so that brings us up to today.
You're right. That's crazy.
And there are still a couple of groups here in the East Coast who go out looking for the Jersey Devil as a group.
Wow, that's
They're
funny.
They're looking for something that's not there.
Yeah, I love that. Your students must love you because you had me captivated. Great, just very interesting the way you just gave all that information. I know people are going to love that. Now, I want to say this because
I'm a professor. That's my job.
Right. Well, you do it well. That's for sure. Because I don't know how long I have you for. I do have a couple questions related to some things. I don't know
Sure,
if I saw it in your book or some different things. But somewhere I've got a couple of things that I wrote down, some notes. One of them being, you mentioned land grabs. So I'd like to see if you could tell us a little bit about that. But then there are a few other things like mermaids, dinosaur bones, cross-dressing royal governors. And then we didn't, I'd like to hear about Benjamin Franklin. If you have time to hit any of those topics,
Yeah, I can give you a few more minutes.
Okay.
The cross-dressing governor. If you go to school in New Jersey, especially like grammar school, maybe high school, you learn the story of Lord Cornberry. Lord Cornberry was the first royal governor of New Jersey. This is in 1701. Prior to that, there were local mayors and things, but there was no royal governor. And in 1701, British government decides they're going to make the New Jersey territory, or the Jersey territory as they called it, a royal colony, which it hadn't been. And they put this guy, Lord Cornberry, in charge of it. He becomes the first royal governor. And he's not very well liked. He's not very good with money. He rubs people the wrong way. He's often considered the worst governor in New Jersey history. And if you know anything about New Jersey history, that's no mean feat.
Right.
To be labeled the worst governor. You got a lot of competition for that.
Yeah.
And so and again, this all sounds so very modern. His enemies began as a way to make him look bad. They started spreading rumors that he was a cross-dresser, which was something which was not very. It was not very well known. It was not something that a lot of people knew about. There have been gay people and trans people all the way back to creation.
Yeah.
And it's doubtful whether Cornberry was actually gay or trans or that he even dressed in women's clothes. It was something that was thrown out because his enemies knew that this was an insult that would get into people's heads and make them hate him. Again, it's like, go Brandon. What does that even mean? It's just a fear word. It's an attack word for somebody who doesn't really deserve it. And so to say that Lord Cornberry dressed in women's clothes, it was the equivalent of that. And if you go to the New York Historical Society, when you walk in, magnificent building, incredible archival collection, and they got a lot of art. And when you walk in, if you turn to the immediate left, there's this big painting, 17th century oil, with the huge heavy frame and of what looks like a really unattractive woman in a beautiful blue dress. Legend had it that this was a portrait of Lord Cornberry in his women's outfit. The reality is, and it's stuck.
Yeah.
Still to this day, if you ask people who was Lord Cornberry, he was a governor of New Jersey who dressed like a woman. There's no evidence that he actually did.
Right.
And this painting, which is always held up, we have no idea who the woman in this picture is. We don't know who painted it. We're not exactly sure when it was painted. I mean, it's obviously a period picture. It's an authentic oil portrait, but there's really no evidence that it was Lord Cornberry. And so this stuff is all over the place. And Ben Franklin comes to Philadelphia, famously, from Boston. And he wants to make a name for himself by publishing an almanac. But the big almanac he's got to go up against is the Leeds Almanac, because a few years after all the burning stuff goes on, he takes another crack at it, Daniel Leeds does, and he republishes a new almanac which becomes very popular and goes into many, many editions. And that's the one that Franklin would have to compete against. But by then the Leeds Almanac is very popular. And so it's Franklin who starts spreading these rumors that Daniel Leeds is a sorcerer, that his son Titan Leeds, who took over publishing the journal, that he was dead and his ghost was running around trying to make people hate Ben Franklin. Absolutely, completely made up.
Yeah.
And see, the thing is, Franklin, he's having a good time. He's saying all this stuff, and Titan Leeds, he doesn't take it well. He takes it a little too personally. And so he started fighting back against it. And every time he would fight against something that Franklin said, Franklin would just say, well, I'm not making this up. This is what's really going on. And he would just sort of laugh to himself and sell more copies of Poor Richard's Almanac, which is why to this day, if you ask people about early American almanacs, they remember Poor Richard because that was Ben Franklin. No one ever remembers the Leeds Almanac.
Right.
Thanks to Ben Franklin.
That's hilarious.
So he was a founding father, and he was also a huge dick.
Yeah. Yeah, as I learn more about him, I go, that's interesting. It's a little bit different than what we think.
Very complex character.
Yeah, for sure.
Ben Franklin, very complex character.
Crazy. If you can, mermaids and dinosaur bones? What's this?
Oh, well, the legend of the Jersey Devil in the late 19th and early 20th centuries doesn't exist in a vacuum. America at the time was full of monster stories. Ghost stories. There's a famous homicidal ghost in London called Spring-Heeled Jack. Very famous, supposedly ran around killing people. There's also a Spring-Heeled Jack in Elizabeth, New Jersey, doing the same thing, running around killing people. And so you get, during the Revolutionary period, you start getting, like in New York, they start finding mastodon bones and digging them up and assembling them, and look at this it looks like an elephant, but it can't be an elephant. It's way bigger than an elephant, so we don't know what this thing is.
Yeah.
And you start getting reports from the Western Territories about these crazy looking creatures, and then in the late 19th century, scientists from Eastern universities start heading out west, and they start digging up dinosaur fossils. Literally tons of them. And so this idea of monsters running around is well entrenched in early American history. It's not a modern thing, and it's not just the Jersey Devil. The Jersey Devil had to compete with a lot of other monsters.
Yeah, that's crazy.
So that's why I put that in there as context, so you know it's the Jersey Devil didn't exist in a vacuum.
Right.
Nothing exists in a vacuum. That's the thing that we try to teach our students. Nothing ever just happens. Everything has a past. Everything has bits and pieces that are floating around that will come together at some point, and you get this thing that we know about, and we think, oh, it just appeared on its own. Nothing ever just appears on its own.
That's a great point.
And so that's why all that other stuff is in there, to give the reader the idea that early America was just spilling over with monsters and ghosts and all kinds of crazy creatures.
I love it. Thank you for sharing that. That's so... people are going to be interested in this for sure. I mean, to really peel back the layers on some of these things and just see how it all comes together, that's pretty darn interesting. And I want to thank you so much for sharing that with us.
That's what I do for a living.
Yeah, and thank you for being on the show. It's been great. Before we start wrapping up
My pleasure.
here,
Thanks for having me on.
I want to ask you this. Is there any new projects coming down, books or anything like that people can keep their eyes out for?
Well, my most recent book is about the various legends and myths about who discovered America, and that's out now. You can get that. You can get all my books really off of Amazon and other places online. And the book I'm working on now is going to be called Darwin and the Monsters, and it's going to be a history of how the role monstrous creatures played in the development of evolutionary theory and modern science.
That's exciting. And this is coming up.
Well, I have a contract for it. It's supposed to be. I'm supposed to be done with it by next June.
Okay.
And then figure another year after that until it hits the shelves.
So people can catch your work on Amazon. Is there any other sites or anything else that people can hop to?
If you go to my Kean University webpage, just Google my name, and it'll be the first thing that comes up. And you can see the classes that I teach. You can see the books I've written. There's a page called what do I call it? Media appearances, where you can get basically anything I've done electronically, podcasts, that kind of thing. They're all there, and you can download them and read them for free. And when this comes out, it'll go on the list there, and people will be able to see this. And so I'm a public historian. Part of my brief is to teach the public history, not just my students.
Yeah, I love it. And you've done a lot of podcasts. Like when I was on your site, I was like, or Kean.
Yeah, I've been doing it for a long time.
Yeah. So this is great. That's why I'm so glad to have had the opportunity to have you on here. And so as we wrap up here, I want to say thank you once again, Brian. Everybody catch his book, go to Amazon, check out his site. You got a sample here of just how interesting his information, the way he presents it. So get the opportunity to read some of his stuff.
The Jersey Devil book is in paperback now.
Yeah, exactly. Check it out, people.
For about $20, I think, something like that.
Well, I want to say have a great fall and a great holiday season, Brian.
Thanks, you too.
Thank you so much for being on here. And for the rest of you, there you go. We've peeled back the layers of the Jersey Devil, and you know a little more than you probably ever did. And thank goodness, Brian, for giving us that info.
It's all fun and games until the historian shows up.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. Well, all right. Everybody out there, remember, there's a lot of strange and unexpected in our reality. So keep your eyes, ears, and minds open. Until next time, stay safe.
Thank you for listening to High Strangeness. This was a glance at some of the strange that exists in our reality.